Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and today I'm here with Dr. Joe Zammit-Lucia. I interviewed Joe in 2022 on The Politics Guys to talk about his book, The New Political Capitalism. I knew when I started Sustainable Planet that I would love to have Joe as a guest to talk about capitalism and sustainability. Joe has a fascinating background. He began as a physician, moved into industry research and development, founded Radix, a nonprofit public policy think tank, and started his own management consulting firm based in Cambridge with offices in New York and Tokyo. Welcome, Joe. It's great of you to take time out of your day to talk to me again.
It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to chat again.
I was happy to see you started writing your newsletter, Random Thoughts, that you publish on LinkedIn, because I really enjoyed reading The New Political Capitalism. Both your book and newsletter make it apparent that sustainability in our capitalist system is a big concern for you. Could you give us your take on sustainability and capitalism, and then talk about how your concern for achieving a sustainable future in this capitalist system has driven your work?
Sure. Maybe we should start by agreeing some definitions on what we mean by capitalism and what we mean by sustainability, because both words tend to get bandied around a lot. So I define capitalism very simply, which is a system that allows individuals to hold and own private capital. And the only alternative to that is communism, where everything is owned by the state. And, some countries tried that experiment and didn't work out particularly well, either for people or indeed for environmental damage. So I don't think we want to go there. So what we do have is essentially in most countries now, maybe all countries, is a mixed system, a mixed economy, where you have private capital, where you have a state as a big part of the economy. And increasingly, we shouldn't forget the third sector, which is also part of economic activities, NGOs and other non-for-profit organizations. So it's a three-legged stool on which our capitalist system stands. Sustainability, I'm assuming that by sustainability, you mean mitigating and maybe restoring environmental damage. Because sustainability is a nice word, but we don't want everything to be sustainable. We don't want sustainable crime. We don't want sustainable poverty. So what we mean by sustainability is essentially environmental issues and environmental damage. So, we have a mixed system, a mixed economy, which survives, essentially, has done well by externalizing a lot of environmental damage. So that's our starting point.
Well, and I would add too, just to elaborate on something you mentioned, because having read your work, that when you say sustainability is about the environment, you in fact actually mean also that it's about the people who are part of that environment. I know that from reading your work, and I just wanted to clarify that, because that is something that does tend to get left out when people make that association with sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. If it wasn't for people's interaction with the environment, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
And so you were going to tell us then about how your concern for achieving a sustainable future in this capitalist system has really driven your work and where you've ended up in life.
Yes. So, the reality of our system of political economy is that it is based on environmental extraction and dumping our detritus back into the environment. I mean, if you look at progress in human terms over the last decades and centuries, we've made progress in almost everything. Poverty has been reduced, illiteracy has been reduced, almost any metric on what one would consider human progress has been going in a positive direction for a very, very long time. The only thing that hasn't been going in a positive direction is a natural capital. So, over the past 30, 40, 50 years, our natural capital has become depleted by about 40% or so, according to the World Bank. So all this human progress has been achieved at the cost of environmental degradation. And that is built in to how our economic system works. So it's no mean task to find a way out of it. What we have been doing is not really creating a sustainable future. What we've been doing is creating a future that is slightly less unsustainable. We've been tinkering at the edges, and we haven't yet found a way to really tackle this market failure, because this is what it is. It's a big market failure of environmental damage caused or as a consequence of or as a part of economic and social progress. Now, how to break that link is no mean feat, because our whole economic system is based on it. And when people say, well, just do this and just do that, it's not as simple as that. We have to, I don't know whether there is a solution, but it's a big, big issue.
Well, and that's just it. You'd be the next Nobel Prize winner, right? If you had that answer, because that is the perennial question, isn't it? And you mentioned the World Bank and their comprehensive wealth accounting that they adopted as a millennium goal. That was something that natural capital was an important part of that formula. They moved away from just looking at how can we have economic growth and how can we increase the GDP of a country by adding in what is the human capital component of this and what is the natural capital component of this. And this is a really important part that oftentimes when we start looking at, well, a government needs to figure out how to make more money, that governments even sometimes forget that those other parts are important components too. And you work with a lot of businesses and consulting businesses, and you face a lot of people who end up focusing on the success of their companies. And democratic governments are just responsible to their citizens and ideally promote sustainable practices, right? And so how do you attempt to open a discourse between the CEOs and the people who you inform and politicians with the work that you do to try to get them to recognize what is important in terms of these multiple parts of the equation as the World Bank has laid out in moving forward?
Yeah, I don't think that discussion is not happening. In my travels, everyone is concerned about this. So, and it's edged its way up the political agenda. So it's hard to have discussions these days where issues around environmental sustainability don't come up. What we've done with national accounting is that, if you like, we've focused exclusively on our income statements, but ignored our balance sheet. And it's only relatively recently that we have realized that natural capital forms an important part of our long-term balance sheet. But it's not, although people recognize this now and recognize the problem, one doesn't get many brownie points for pointing out problems without having solutions, or at least having ways to ameliorate the problem, because a lot of these things are not really solvable, but at least we can ameliorate. So I think that there is a concern. I think people realize all this, and everybody's struggling to find ways forward. And the ways forward so far have been, as I said, tinkering around the edges. Okay, let's make plastics recyclable. Let's cut down on waste of this, that, and the other. Let's make packaging more environmentally friendly. These are all good things, but they don't get to the core of the issue. And I don't think we have anything at the moment that gets to the core of the issue. It's There's also, I think, it's important to distinguish between what we can call live nature and dead nature. So, if we go and extract copper out of seams in the rock, it doesn't matter. The rock is not going to collapse, or, our ecosystems are not going to collapse because we've extracted that copper. Okay? That's not really a big deal. Eventually, the copper will run out and we'll have to find something else. But extracting that dead nature, if you like, is not a big problem. The trouble, of course, is that the process used to extract that dead nature damages a lot of live nature. And we've made progress there too, in that, mining practices have changed. Mining companies are required to do environmental restoration after they've finished their mining. So we're making progress on all these things. But there is still an unresolvable tension. People want more housing. People want bigger housing. You can't have more housing without using up land. We have to feed 8 billion people around the world. We're not going to do that with going back to artisanal agriculture. It's just not going to happen. So there are various, things that pull in opposite directions. And the reality, of course, is that, politics responds to citizens' needs. And the reality is that it's hard to get citizens motivated to do something that might have a benefit in 10 or 20 years' time when their primary concern is putting food on the table today.
Sure. And that definitely goes to, you were mentioning corporations and governments and so forth being aware of these issues, but especially with global South countries, what you just said is mostly what's on their mind first and foremost, right? How can we make sure that we are meeting people's basic needs and trying to improve just the standard of living? It's not about the stuff you were talking about that we in the global North have the luxury of worrying about, which is, oh, well, we have all this packaging. What should we do with it? That's a very different sort of concern, yeah?
It is. It is very different. And of course, people define basic needs. What constitutes basic needs keep expanding the wealthier people get. So, basic needs might mean having 3 televisions and 2 cars if you're American, or, 10,000-foot house or whatever. And those citizens start to consider those basic needs. Our appetite for wanting ever more is likely insatiable.
And you mentioned housing a few times now, and your sentiments about affordable housing echo a recent episode that we did. How is putting a price tag on land and nature indicative of your bigger concerns about markets destroying societies? Because we're talking about societies here as the basis of what we care about, right?
We are. And the question then arises, is there a market solution to these issues? Or is the only solution somewhat more heavy-handed state intervention? Now, the politics of different countries, of course, will drive a different balance. So, in the United States, there is more of an aversion to state intervention. It's more embedded in your culture than maybe in some European countries or in China. So, what is politically possible is actually different in different countries. Jean-Claude Juncker once said, he used to be the president of the European Commission and Prime Minister of Luxembourg before that. He once said, as politicians, we know what we have to do or what we should be doing, but we don't know how to get reelected if we actually do it. So at the end of the day, it's the incentives that drive behavior. So, corporations now have to face the idea that they still have to make their quarterly numbers, but they have to make them in a different way. they have to find ways of internalizing some of those externalities. And internalizing your externalities costs money. And doing that while still delivering on your financials and on your and to your shareholders as part of the multi-stakeholder, this is not easy. It's very easy to condemn corporations, but we're not sitting in that hot seat. And it's actually very difficult to balance all these things.
Yeah, you noted in a recent Random Thoughts post that many have bought into the idea that the only way to save nature is by pursuing market-based solutions. But in fact, you assert that that's not necessarily the situation, that a market-based approach can actually undermine rather than promote conservation.
Indeed. And so I think the discussion we need to have is, what is the appropriate mix of interventions to work through this issue of sustainability and environmental protection? What in that mix, how much do we need state intervention? Which parts of it might be workable through some market solution? And which part requires or would be helped by the intervention of the third sector in terms of non-profit organizations through philanthropy or other methods? It's a jigsaw puzzle and a complicated one. So, we need to have that discussion, but some people will move, because of their political leanings, will move immediately to, we must only have market solutions. Others will say, well, the market solutions just don't work. We need the state to barge in and tell everybody what to do. And that just depends on one's own political preferences.
Well, and there are a few things that go along with this, which is the fact that people and consumers are at the basis of, as you just mentioned, if you want to get reelected, you need that support of the people to get that reelection, right? And governments are constrained by what people are willing to allow governments to do. Governments can enact whatever policies they want, but to actually be able to implement them and enforce them and carry through with them, that's a very different story. And so since consumption is driven by status, right, where do we even begin to change consumer habits, especially since I argue the capitalist system, as you noted, isn't going to be replaced anytime soon by any other economic system?
No, it isn't. And you're right. I mean, consumption is a marker of status. And there's nothing new about that. That's been through the ages. The pharaohs weren't exactly low consumption. The medieval kings in Europe were not exactly low consumption.
But since they were the ones at the top who could only be the ones with most consumption, it didn't matter. But now we're in a very different world, yeah?
Absolutely. So the issue, I think, is not that humanity is driven by consumption and that's a problem. That's always been the case. That's just human nature. What has happened is that instead of 5 people at the top being the only people who can consume, now we have billions of people who've been lifted out of poverty, who've made it to the middle class, and themselves can consume. So if you like, it's the cost of progress. We've made people wealthier. We've made them better off. We've made people able to consume more, vast numbers of people. So, naturally our consumption has soared. But finding a way out of that is not easy, because I don't think one gets much chance of being elected if the platform is, I'm going to make everybody poorer.
And so how do we get people to really care about how and where products are made, right? How do we get businesses to pursue more sustainable outcomes when so many people are tied to quarterly reports, but the quarterly reports are based on what the consumers want?
Yes. But I think we've, even in that aspect, we've made progress. So most corporations now will share in their annual reports what they're doing on the sustainability front, what they're doing on the environmental front, et cetera, et cetera. So the very fact that that's now included in the discussion is progress. Let's be clear about that. Is it enough? Maybe not. Is it ever going to be enough? Maybe not. But I describe myself as as an optimistic realist. I'm a bit Whiggish about this in that I think that progress is inevitable. Where we have discussions is that different people have different views of what constitutes progress. That's the first thing. And that's something that's up for political debate. The second is that even if we can see or if we can agree what constitutes progress, let's imagine that we could agree that less environmental damage constitutes progress. Actually achieving that while still being constrained with, everything that everybody's constrained by is actually very challenging. It's no solution to say corporations shouldn't worry about their quarterly numbers. That's just not going to happen. Just like it's no solution to say governments should do what they want and not worry about getting reelected. This is just fantasy world. So the question is, how do we navigate these treacherous paths and find a way forward? Of course, I don't have the solution, but I think that what we can all take encouragement from is that this is now an active part of the conversation. It's very hard to meet anybody in business these days or in politics. There are some, of course, there are always some who say this is a load of woke nonsense and we just don't need to worry about it. It's very hard to find people who really take that view about environmental damage.
What are the trade-offs of having more people driving electric vehicles made in China? This goes to what you were just saying, because you were saying, more people should be environmentally conscious and more people are aware of what's going on and more corporations are too. But there are trade-offs of having Chinese imports into US and European markets. You don't think it's better that China can provide less expensive cars to more people to help reduce carbon emissions and put a dent in these greenhouse gas emissions problem we've got?
Yes, well, that is, of course, better if you look at it through the single lens of environmental issues. But we can't look at things through a single lens. We have to look at them through multiple lenses. So one of the promises of the green industrial revolution, which has been made as a big promise in order to get people on board politically, one of the big promises has been that this was a new industrial revolution that was going to create a ton of jobs and was going to make people more prosperous, as well as cleaning up the air we breathe and everything else. Well, that promise will soon fall apart if all that prosperity and jobs go to China. So, we will lose political support for the green transition if all our green technology is imported from China. And to my mind, that outweighs the question of, well, let's get as much cheap stuff from China as possible so that we can have a green transition. Because if we do that, I don't think the green transition will happen. I think we'll lose political support for it. And then it's very difficult to claw that back. So I think we have to look at these things from multiple lenses. And one of the issues with environmental policy and environmental activism is that too many people look at it as though it's something that stands on its own. What's our environmental policy? Or what do we want to be activist about regarding the environment? But really, environmental issues affect every aspect of policy. Fiscal policy, social policy, industrial policy, anything you can think of, they each have an environmental component. So focusing on things with only a green lens will get us nowhere, because those actions affect every aspect of policy.
And we see that with the protests that have happened across Europe. We see the same thing happening in the United States, where people are resisting that. Like, hey, you can't change, expect us to give up what seems like everything to us, right? We're paying a huge cost here for this trade-off. And I think what a point that you're making that's important here is that a democratic foundation really is important to climate change, achieving climate change goals, and potentially can even expedite this. And with an authoritarian regime like China, who's taking the benefit from the production that has happened elsewhere and now selling that back at a much lower rate, it's actually undermining the foundation that had been laid.
Yeah, absolutely. And China, of course, is pragmatic about this, because although they leaders in many areas to do with sustainable technologies, and they've installed a huge amount of renewable energy, et cetera, themselves, their carbon emissions keep soaring because their energy needs are ever expanding. So, let's be clear about China. They've been pragmatic. They've not been willing to let their environmental impact slow down their industrial development. But as part of that industrial development, they realized that leadership in sustainable technologies was something they wanted to do, and they've done it very well. There is, of course, among some environmental activists, there is an authoritarian streak which says this is so important that we have to shove it down people's throats. And to me, that's a road to nowhere. I understand why people feel strongly about this, but the challenge of being a political operative in a democratic system is, how do you make decisions when every citizen wants something different from you? And that's a very, very difficult skill that politicians have, that business people don't have, for instance, because, businesses are more towards the authoritarian side of how they work than towards the democratic side of how they work. And trying to juggle all of that is a challenge. And I believe that, some activists don't acknowledge just how difficult this transition is going to be. We want everything yesterday, and it just can't be done.
I think that there are a few things worth reflecting on that you've mentioned. One is that activists can turn a lot of people off by being militant, right? And another thing I think too is that the advantage of China being authoritarian is they don't have to be quite as responsive to the people, right? And so they can make some of those sort of same policy changes, which has allowed them to really be at the forefront and decide, we're going to work on this green technology. We're going to try to cut back on the number of our coal usage, even though, as you said, because of the shortage of just the huge need for energy in China, they're still building coal plants, even though they really are trying to scale that back. And that, what all this boils down to is that China really has a huge self-interest, a very pragmatic, realist approach to what's going on, because they've got 1 billion people. They're like, between India and China, you've got 1/3 of the world's population. If they don't start doing something, they're the ones who are going to pay a humongous price for what's going on, right? And we see the same. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, what China has shown us, and not everything that China does, of course, can be easily translated to what we might do in a democratic environment. But I think what we need to realize is that these are wicked problems, and they can't be resolved by industry alone, and they can't be resolved by government alone. And what we need to do is to establish what we're calling a viable industry government ecosystem that allows these things, that helps these things evolve. Now, in the West, we don't have much experience of industry government ecosystems. We had our industrial policies of the 1970s, which didn't work very well, because essentially all they did was splash out money, try to pick winners, try to create national champions, which were then wrapped in cotton wool and therefore became hugely uncompetitive. That 1970s style industrial policy didn't work very well. And through the 80s and 90s, there was a backlash against that. And the mindset was government should keep out of everything because they've screwed up industrial policy. What we need now is a different type of industrial policy. As I keep saying, industrial policy is dead. Long live industrial policy. We need to establish a government industry ecosystem that works, and that works for the long term. And that is very challenging because industry in many countries, and particularly in the United States, hates the idea of working with government. The best government is one that keeps out of my face. In Europe, we have maybe more of a tradition, but it's an old-fashioned tradition. Too much corporatism, too much protection of vested interests, too much protection of the big companies who are seen to be the big employers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, if you take China and electric vehicles as an example, what they did is they provided a base on which companies were then forced to compete. 20 years ago, there were more than 500 startups in the electric vehicle industry in China. Okay? Today, they're whittled down to 20 to 50 through vicious competition. They were forced to compete with each other, just like the different regions in China are forced to compete with each other. So what emerges are not companies that have had the red carpet rolled out to them by government, that has said, oh, well, you're Boeing, you're so important, I have to protect you. What has emerged is the result of fierce competition on a playing field that was laid out by the government. We don't know how to do that. We've never done that, but it's something we need to learn from. So I think how we create a vibrant, competitive, dynamic industry government ecosystem, to me, is the challenge for the next few decades.
And there is a lot of resistance to that, as you mentioned, especially in the United States, where a lot of corporations are based, big corporations that have a lot of say in what goes on in the world and influences other corporations throughout the world, that the corporations and even the people seem to think that government is just in the way and complaining about taxes
Right.
and looking for loopholes and pushing to minimize government interference. And what we actually really need, though, is public good that the government offers with policy regulation. And I think that, to me, when you talk about the three pillars you mentioned a few times in our discussion, you've got corporations, you've got government, but you've also got the NGOs and the IGOs, the organizations that are out there. And to me, what you're really talking about when you talk about the industry government ecosystem is you're really just talking about a neoliberal economic system to me. Because to me, a neoliberal economic system is that system where we try very much as human beings from all of these different facets to come together and find one policy that we can get everybody on the same page. And you've got the corporations who want to do their thing, and the government's trying to do their thing, and you've got citizens, and you've got IGOs and NGOs all in the mix, and they're all sort of trying to get their point across. But what I argue, and I don't know if you agree with me here, so I'm really curious to see what you have to say, is that to me, having that one global policy, have everybody on the same page, that means that corporations can't cheat no matter where they're located. It means that governments aren't saying, oh, yeah, but in the United States, they get to do this while we in Europe are paying this huge price. Would you agree with that?
Well, it would be ideal, but I think it's utopian. The days of international cooperation are more or less over. The WTO is dead. We have a feeling, and I think it's a feeling. I don't think it's real, but it's a feeling nevertheless, and therefore it's what matters. We have a feeling that things are bad, that things are not as good as they used to be, that economic, socio-economic, political economy system is not working very well. And when people think that things are bad, they focus inwards. It's much easier to cooperate with others when you're feeling great. So I think we're in a phase now where the idea of any kind of global agreement on anything is for the birds. And there are things that are happening that will make that even more difficult. So, as you know, a number of climate activist groups have been suing governments for not living up to their international agreements, legally binding international agreements. And they've been winning some of these cases. Now, what is going to be the result of that? In my view, the result of that is not going to be a dramatic acceleration of climate policy, because we don't know how to do that. The result of that over time is going to be that nobody's ever going to sign up to legally binding global agreements again, because they don't want to get caught. So these things are double-edged swords. And, it's difficult enough to get the British people to support any policy as a whole, or the American people all to say this is a great policy. That's never going to happen. But, to multiply that and believe that we can get some kind of global agreement on anything is, I think, at the moment, for the birds.
Yeah, at the same time, I was going to say, at the same time, we've got the Paris Agreement. We need to make some change, or else we're going to all be boiling to death here, right? And so change needs to happen, and yet it's like everything you said is so accurate, that in terms of the fact that getting everyone on the same page is really difficult, and then the resistance that happens as a result of that, and even using what we think of as sort of the civilized, channels of legal courts and systems, all of those institutions that have been set up and we prize and value as good, democratic, civilized people, that actually is going to backfire.
Yes, I think we have to be careful. I mean, from the activist side, there's always, you mentioned turning people off, and you're a political scientist, so you know this better than I do. There's been a lot of literature and writing about the activist dilemma. If you don't shout loud enough, you don't get heard. If you shout too loud, people turn against you. And nothing's changed there. It's always been the case. But, I think change is happening. I mean, it's all very well to say change has to happen. I think a substantial majority of people accept that as a theoretical concept. But once you get into what change, over what period, exactly how, and who are going to be the winners and losers, then that's when you start to get into real difficulties. We can all say, yes, change has to happen, otherwise we're going to boil to death. But making it happen is something different. And I don't think it's for lack of will or lack of try. I think it's just because it's very difficult.
It is. It's certainly definitely difficult. Yeah. And it seems like investors and businesses themselves, and maybe even governments, are convinced that ESG funds are the primary way to sort of achieve, at least in part, and certainly in the corporate part, to get business to be more responsible, short of actually enacting laws. And I'm not quite as, I think that the neoliberal system is still there, and I'm still hanging on to hope, but I am also skeptical. So as you mentioned,
it depends what you mean by the neoliberal system.
The one I described, whereas I see like all of these people connecting and trying very hard to put one policy in place, but I know it's not there. And I know, but I want to believe that can happen. And so what would you offer to our listeners as the key issues with the ESG, environmental, social, and governance funds? Because you've written a bit about this and you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah. So, as with everything, nothing is perfect. So I think the fact that we have ESG funds, the fact that ESG is being talked about, the fact that people are reporting on the ESG stuff, I think all this is good stuff because it keeps these issues as part of the discussion on the future of corporations and their role in our society, which is essentially the debate we're having. So I think it's a good thing that this discussion has happened. Unfortunately, these things do tend to go down rabbit holes. So, one of the issues we're seeing with ESG investing and everything else is that it quickly can degenerate into a box ticking exercise. What do I need to do to score high on this ESG stuff? And let's forget about it. And, let me set up a department somewhere out of the way so that I don't have to bother about it anymore. But these are normal human reactions, which we should have expected. There's nothing surprising about any of it. So I think that it has lifted all these issues to being real considerations within corporations. I think that's essentially a good thing. The danger, of course, is that we are human beings. So the natural reaction to any kind of constraint that's put upon us is to try and game it. And, that is always the case. People say you can only, people say what gets measured gets managed. Well, there's another saying, which is what gets measured gets gained. So, so we see a lot of things that are happening that, might satisfy people and tick a box, but don't really achieve very much. I mean, take divestment from oil and gas companies, okay? If I sell my shares in an oil and gas company, it means that somebody else is willing to buy it, okay? Nothing has happened except a change of ownership, okay? The oil companies have not even noticed whether it's you or I who own the shares. It's made no difference to their stock price. It certainly made no difference to their balance sheet and their ability to finance new projects. It's actually made no difference at all. But, we pretend to feel good about it. It's virtue signaling. And these virtue signaling things, which lots of people fight for, actually delay progress because they give the impression of progress when nothing is happening. We can say, I've divested from oil and gas in my portfolio. Great. That's achieved absolutely nothing except that maybe I can feel better at a cocktail party when I say that. Okay?
And
if I'm with the right people.
Yes. And until enough people actually do this, that it makes a difference to the business, then they're going to continue. They have no incentive to change. Right. And that's why I was saying that,
but let's
on an international.
Let's take it even to the next level. Let's take it to the next level even. Let's imagine that we could get a divestment movement going that's big enough so that companies like Exxon or BP or Shell,
one of many, right?
actually feel the pressure. Well, what's going to happen? Okay? Most oil and gas is produced by state-owned companies. So, these private companies on whom we actually can have influence would be taken over by Saudi Aramco, Petrobras, Gazprom, everybody else. You try and influence those people, okay? It's self-harm clothed in virtuousness.
And that's why I say we need one policy that everybody around the world has to abide by. But the reality of that, I know. It's just a pipe dream.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. So a good business plan then is built around sustainable practices. As you've said here, that it's more than good just PR. It should be more than just good PR. But some of it just seems like that's all it's been kind of amounts to is, like you said, I feel good as an investor. The company says, look, you can go to my webpage, look at all of this sustainability stuff I'm doing. They all have it, right? So how do you encourage corporation to move beyond value added to the product of adding values beyond anything that's just another marketing campaign? I mean, you consult for businesses. How do you convince all those acronyms at the top, the CEOs and CFOs and COOs and so forth? How do you get that, convince them to move beyond just something that's good PR for them?
Well, I mean, in my experience, most of the people I speak to in corporations actually want to do this, but it's not their only constraint. They have to juggle a million different things. Okay. If you're selling a product that is 50% cheaper if you source it from China, from a factory that's fired by coal power, and if your customers actually want that, then what do? You can say, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to make my product 50% more expensive. Well, that doesn't help because 10 other competitors will come in and undercut you. So these are the realities of life. I don't see a lack of willingness. Of course, there are some people who think this is all a waste of time and we can all go back to how we were and, get out of my hair. There are always those people, but frankly, they don't matter. I think this is now embedded, and most people are honestly trying to move in this direction. It's a long-term play, and I think all sides of this discussion need to understand that this is a long-term play and we can't achieve everything tomorrow morning or even yesterday. And in the meantime, while you're doing this long-term play, what's wrong with getting short-term benefits by touting the little actions that you've done? If nothing else, all this advertising, even if the product itself is marginal, environmentally friendly packaging, okay, pretty marginal to anything. But the fact that lots of companies are promoting that embeds in people's minds that environmental issues are important. So rather than see it as hypocritical PR, maybe we should see it as, the power of marketing and advertising in the corporate world actually embedding the idea that environmental issues are important. And without that expenditure, but we're never going to change attitudes. You can have as many government education campaigns as you like. They don't work. But mass advertising works. And if every mass advertising that we see today has some sort of nod to environmental sustainability, that changes people's views over time. It becomes an important part of how they think and how they feel and how they see themselves in the world. So rather than knocking it as superficial, let's be thankful that it is another step on the path on making these things relevant to the average person in the street.
But the question is this long game that we're playing going to cash in soon enough that actually helps us to not end up going over 2 degrees or the track of 3 degrees in climate change that we're facing? And you argue that degrowth is a sustainable solution that allows people to become more prosperous. And I agree with you. Yeah. Yet the movement is unlikely to gain traction. And why not? Well, why shouldn't people support degrowth when it can help solve our climate change problems?
Well, I'm not so sold on degrowth as you suggest, because I don't know really what it means. My friends who are in degrowth, in the degrowth factor, in the degrowth group, I usually ask them one question. Can you describe to me what the average citizen's life is going to look like under a degrowth political economy? And they can't do that. But until you can describe that to people and make them feel that that is actually a better life, then it's not going to happen. There are also big political issues with degrowth. Okay, we are human beings. Okay, remember that. One of the reasons that Marx's great work failed is because it didn't take into account humanity and how people behave. So if we have a non-growing economy, the battle becomes on who is going to appropriate most of those fixed resources. Okay? We don't really want to live in a world like that. We don't want to be living in a world where we believe that resources are finite, they'll never grow, So our only way of getting better is to steal from someone else. Okay? We don't want that world. So I think there are lots of questions to be asked and examined around this degrowth agenda. I don't think it's straightforward. And, our well-being and the appeal of our system depends on the promise of growth, that everybody's going to get a better life tomorrow than they had yesterday. Now, admittedly, those benefits are not equally shared, but everybody's getting some of it. And once you shut that down, then I fear for social cohesion and social structure. So your other question is, are we going to do it fast enough? My view is we're going to do it as fast as we can. Now, if that's fast enough by some standards and not fast enough by others, so be it. But, you can't get me to run 100 meters in 10 seconds. I just can't do it. Okay? It's desirable and I'd love to do it, but I can't. Okay? So there's no point telling me that if I want to win the race, I have to do it in 10 seconds. I just can't do it. Okay? So let's be practical about this. We're going to do it, I think, as fast as is politically, technologically, and socially, and fiscally, and financially possible. We can't do it any faster than that. What the impact on that is on things like climate change, biodiversity, etc., I have no idea. And you can ask 10 people and you'll get 25 different answers. But I think that this has been lifted up the agenda. I think there is widespread awareness. I don't think we have widespread enough buy-in in yet among the citizenship. I think the buy-in actually among the corporate world is bigger than it is among the citizenship. And ultimately it's the citizenship that matters because they're the ones who elect whoever they elect. So I think things are progressing. They're progressing at a pace. We may be able to accelerate it as technology advances, as people become more aware, as people find better ways of achieving these things without having to resort to the apocalyptic hair shirt narrative that, we all need to be poorer because otherwise the world is going to burn. That doesn't get many people on board. So there's still a lot to do. But I think if we look in the rear view mirror from where we were in the 1950s and where we were when Silent Spring was first published, we've come one heck of a long way.
I think that your point about Marx is that the irony of that is that his main concern was that the capitalist system was breaking down human relations and breaking down societies. And we definitely have seen that happen, where we see a lot of populist movements and threats of populism around the world separating more and more people. And yet when we look at what's going on in the world, as you just said, you sound like you're pretty optimistic about where we've gone and the direction that we're going. And with everything that has happened and gone on in the world, even since you've written The New Political Capitalism was published. And so you are still optimistic about achieving climate change goals, yeah?
Well, I'm optimistic about making progress. Goals are things we've arbitrarily set. Whether we hit them or not is no different to whether your CEO is going to hit his quarterly earnings. Okay, these are arbitrary goals that we've set. Whether they're achievable, how they're achievable, I have no idea. But I think the trajectory of progress is there. But let me say something about progress, because I think many people think of progress, and certainly in the business world, people think of progress as being like navigating a powerboat on calm seas, where you say, I want to get from place A to place B. I'll set my GPS in the straightest possible line. I make sure I have enough fuel, and I get there as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Okay? Well, that's not how social progress happens. Social progress is like being in a small sailing boat in a storm. okay? Where you have to tack this way and that as the political winds change, where you make a little bit of progress forward and then you get a wave that pushes you back, where you take on water and you suddenly have to keep bailing so that you don't sink, where you have a general idea of the direction, but not actually any idea of the route you're going to have to take there. That's a very different kind of progress, but that's how social progress happens. And in order to navigate social progress, just like navigating a sailing boat in a storm, you need a different set of skills, and you also need a different boat. So there's too much, I think, of people thinking that progress goes in a nice, neat, straight line, or should go in a nice, neat, straight line without any hindrance. But, that's just fantasy. That's not how the world works. So I think in the turbulent seas that we are in, and that we had kidded ourselves. I mean, people of my generation had kidded ourselves that these turbulent seas had actually calmed down because the post-war world, was actually pretty stable, and we were all doing well, and the economies were growing and everything else, and we thought this was now the new norm. It was the end of history. Well, we were wrong, and that was just an aberration. We're now back in turbulent seas, and we just have to accept that, and progress will be messy, just like it always is. But I think that it's there, and progress is happening. And we should be more optimistic about how we make it happen. What can we do to make it happen a little bit better and a little bit faster? But I've had enough of this endless anger by everybody. Everybody seems angry about everything these days. Personally, I don't want to lead my life like that, being angry at the world. I don't think it's a particularly fun way to live. So I like to concentrate on where we're making progress, what the trajectory is, and whether in any modest way I can contribute to making that progress a little bit easier.
And as you said, the world is a messy place and we do the best we can, right?
Exactly.
And so
we muddle through.
Yes, we muddle through. So with that, we'll close. Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I really enjoyed interviewing you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. If you enjoyed my interview with Joe on Sustainable Planet, or even if you didn't, let me know. You can reach me at mail at splanetpod.com or on Facebook, Instagram, X, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll find these links in our show notes on our website, splanetpod.com. We'd really appreciate if you rate and review Sustainable Planet on your podcast app. It only takes a minute and it'll really help us out. Thanks for listening and have a sustainable day.